This thrilling story tells of pandemonium, the invasion of demons. A portal suddenly opened in the country from which countless demons emerged, and humanity found itself on the brink of destruction. People could not resist these creatures and were forced to flee. A young man ran with all his strength, trying to escape the imminent threat, but a demon soon caught up with him. The young man fell to the ground in horror. Realizing there was no point in running any longer, he screamed desperately for help, hoping someone would hear him. At that moment, a man suddenly appeared and managed to drive the demon away. This man was one of the few who could resist the demons. Regaining consciousness after the shock, the young man asked his savior if he had really awakened. However, the savior had no time to explain and only told him to run immediately before the demon regained its senses. This savior turned out to be an awakened ranker named Daniel. When the protagonist was distracted for a moment, the demon awoke again and lunged at him. However, Daniel managed to cover its mouth with his hand. As the demon's fangs sank into his arm, Daniel wondered whether his strike would be too weak to stun the creature. He began to doubt whether as a rank D he would be able to defeat it. The demon tried to break free and swung its claws, but the hero held it with one hand while simultaneously drawing his dagger. Then Daniel suddenly plunged the dagger into the demon's head. After defeating the creature, Daniel collapsed to the ground, trying to catch his breath. The young man nearby who had almost died fled in terror, realizing he had narrowly escaped death. Although Daniel had slain the demon, he knew he could barely handle even a single monster. His wound was deep, leaving him practically defenseless. Rank D was one of the lowest among the awakened, and with such limited strength he could only watch as people ran past begging for salvation. Daniel wondered if this was all he was capable of and felt pathetic. Suddenly the sounds of battle echoed nearby. A blonde awakened man with a sword appeared, his weapon crackling with lightning. A massive worm-like monster launched a sonic attack, but the blonde man instantly leapt forward and struck, destroying the demon with a single blow. Daniel was astonished. That man had dealt with a creature Daniel himself would never have dared to approach, and in only a few seconds, it turned out this man was Dragon Sword, a close friend of the hero and heir to his clan's martial arts. The protagonist felt a pang of envy. If he had also been an heir to such a clan, he would not have fallen after fighting only one demon. In 2031, long before the pandemonium, the awakened began to appear suddenly around the world. They possessed powers humanity could never have imagined. Their descendants inherited not only their strength, but also the ability to control it. Daniel, however, awakened at rank F with no inheritance. No matter how hard he tried, the highest level he could reach remained D. Daniel sighed, thinking about what could have been. If he had been born into an awakened clan, he might have risen beyond rank. Perhaps his life would have been different. Yet he realized that at that moment all he could do was regret the past. The hero accepted that this was his end, but then Daniel heard a system notification. It mentioned a new attribute called the Path of the Warrior. He did not understand what it meant and laughed bitterly, arguing that the system did not care about his fate. He believed he was unlucky and that this attribute would not help him when his life hung by a thread. Daniel's last thought before dying was how much he hated the system. He died soon after and before passing, saw a strange pattern. However, he suddenly awoke in bed. The young man was astonished to still be alive. Looking around, he realized he was in a room he had not entered since his school days, and could not understand how this was possible. After all, he had been mortally wounded while trying to save someone and had died. Trying to comprehend what had happened, Daniel opened the system window. The date shown was January 2025. He could not believe what he was seeing and cried out, unable to understand how he had returned to the past. Daniel tried to make sense of it all. Could it be that he had simply dreamed of his future? He quickly dismissed that idea as impossible and decided to test the situation further. Approaching the window, he saw the school building. He also saw a sports field where the awakened training was about to begin. Everything looked exactly the same as it did every day, almost frighteningly identical. Daniel wondered again if he had really gone back 7 years. He sat on the bed, trying to comprehend what had happened. He remembered dying from a wound in his side which he had felt only moments ago, yet now the pain was gone and there was no trace of it. Daniel wondered if his injuries meant that his death had been the starting point for a return to the past. The hero suspected that something unique, something found only in manhwas, had happened. Most importantly, he had no idea what to do next. After all, in 7 years a new great war would begin, and he believed he could not change anything in the past. Since Daniel had returned to the body he had 7 years ago, he decided to check his current stats. His title was loser, his potential was unclassified, and his skills were meditation, 3 basic sword techniques and leg techniques. His attribute was Path of the Warrior. The hero smiled when he saw these characteristics, for they were the same as before his death. Daniel touched the system interface, which again prompted him to make a choice. The chosen path could not be changed. The names of powerful martial arts flashed through Daniel's mind. All of these paths were forms of martial arts, and now he simply had to select one. In his previous life he had achieved nothing and had died dishonorably. Remembering this, Daniel made his decision with resolve. The world had changed. Korea and the entire eastern region now resembled a fantasy realm of martial arts. This was possible thanks to the first generation of awakened people who at a certain moment faced a critical decision. Europe and America chose the magical path of Grantos, while Asia embraced Muram. It was into this world that Daniel had returned, surrounded by powerful martial artists. He thought about those who did not fit into either system and decided that he first needed to eliminate the fighters of the 3 spheres. Suddenly he noticed something unusual. Alongside the martial arts he already knew, there were several others. Among them one stood out in particular, the divine source art. As far as Daniel could remember, it did not belong to any specific branch of martial arts. Determined to take advantage of this, he selected it, but the divine source art turned out to be far beyond what he had expected. It carried an SS rank, almost unimaginable. Along with gaining this new art, he lost all the abilities tied to the 3 basic techniques he had previously used. Some time later, after leaving the dormitory, Daniel found a secluded spot and began to meditate. When he was younger, he used to come here to train away from the ridicule of others. Lost in thought, he realized he could not remain trapped in the past. For now, it was important to focus on the present. Taking a deep breath, he continued to meditate, gradually feeling energy flow through his body. This new technique gave him completely different sensations. When he opened his eyes, he noticed that his gaze burned with flames and his blood seemed to boil. He realized that training at the SSS level was incomparable to the old F-level abilities. Suddenly an interface appeared in front of Daniel. The system reported that he had obtained the first star of a martial art created by a master who had achieved enlightenment. The divine source art allowed complete mastery of energy concentration. Even after just a few minutes of meditation, he sensed how different this technique was from the previous 3 pillars. By meditating solely on this art, one could reach unprecedented heights. The system assigned the first main task, introductory training for the path of the divine source, with a difficulty rating of D. Despite the apparent complexity of the task, he was confident he could handle it with his current abilities. Daniel meditated until nightfall, continuing to gather energy to reach the 2nd level. However, the training went too far. Suddenly he heard a displeased voice scolding him for overdoing it. An old man ordered Daniel to stop meditating and open his eyes. Startled, Daniel snapped out of his meditation. He then collapsed onto the grass, clutching his heart and convulsing. After such a shock, he was surprised to still be alive and tried to understand what was happening. No matter how hard he tried, it was impossible to stop the meditation. If he continued, he would certainly die on the spot. An unfamiliar voice explained what was happening to him while Daniel looked around. He could not tell where the voice was coming from and tried to discover the stranger's name. Suddenly a quiet laugh sounded behind him. When the hero turned, he saw an old man in white robes standing there. At first, Daniel thought it was a ghost, but the old man seemed unprepared for such a reaction. Even so, Daniel remained curious about who this stranger was. The old man stated that the venerable figure the boy was seeing was the strongest man in history. According to the elder, he was a master of martial arts. Daniel was astonished to learn that the person before him was a true master. The name seemed familiar, and he soon recalled information about the master. It was he who had created the divine source art. Daniel wondered if this old man was truly the founder of that art. The elder admitted that Daniel, despite all his apparent foolishness, was not completely stupid. He then asked if it was really so difficult to recognize him, even in his current form. Daniel, stunned by what he had heard, was amazed to think that there really was a person who had created this martial art. He could hardly comprehend that such a thing was possible, and it seemed even more unbelievable that this man was speaking to him at that very moment. The old man confessed that, because of the hero's impenetrable foolishness, his divine source art had been sealed. This martial art was the most powerful in human history, and its loss would be a disaster. Daniel understood the meaning of these words, though it was difficult for him to fully grasp the greatness of the art. Seeing that the student had only a superficial understanding of his explanation, the old man lightly tapped Daniel on the head with his fan. He reminded him that thousands of young people dreamed merely of hearing about a master of this level, and that such an opportunity was rare. Despite the old man's noise and scolding, Daniel tried to explain that he was ready to continue meditating on his own. The elder suggested that he attempt to meditate for at least 100 days. However, the old man warned him about the possibility of ki contamination. Daniel, terrified by the idea of potential energy damage, suddenly grasped the seriousness of the situation, but the elder said there was nothing surprising about it. It was simply a fact. If Daniel trained alone, he would never reach the level of 2 stars. The hero complained to the old master that such words were hardly motivating. They were frightening, yet the truth was that he genuinely wanted to grow stronger. The old man admitted that he did not have a ready-made training program for the hero. Daniel immediately agreed and decided to create a plan himself, relying on his own desire to achieve the goal. The elder noticed his determination and tenacity. Then he agreed to be at least a little generous after his death. A little later, Daniel went to a cafe to rest. The entire situation had deeply affected him. He had barely sighed when suddenly a spirit appeared and asked why he was sighing so heavily, since luck was clearly on his side. Terrified, Daniel begged the spirit not to appear so suddenly again, or else he might die of fright. He then looked at his phone as he received a text message. Soon his card was charged and 40 billion monetary units were debited from his account. The old man explained with a smile that this was the only way to make the hero stronger. Although he himself could hardly agree with such methods, using chains weighing 50 kilograms on one's feet was extremely difficult. Daniel sat at the table and, showing his dissatisfaction, pointed out how strange these conditions were. He suggested that the master try wearing the chains himself. Just then, a waitress appeared in front of him. The hero's behavior made those around him think something was wrong with him. Feeling embarrassed, Daniel stopped speaking and turned to the system interface. He realized that leveling up would not be as easy as he had imagined, but after learning the divine source skill, his ki limit had increased to 620. This immediately demonstrated the power of the art. The old man emphasized that this was the pinnacle of his martial arts and the main way to develop his potential. Daniel agreed to the instruction, and thanks to the elder's help, he managed to reach the 2-star level by choosing a relatively easy path. He then closed the interface and stood up, preparing for new challenges. The hero stated that the shackles were already ready. When Daniel left the cafe, he was immediately called by familiar faces. The hero calmly turned around and saw 3 of his former classmates. They commented mockingly that they had run into a well-known loser. They reminded him of his habit of sitting in the dormitory and rarely going out. All 3 were rank EM, and although that was below their potential strength compared to the hero's former rank F, they still appeared significantly stronger. The hero suggested they leave him alone and go about their business. However, one of them disagreed and shoved Daniel, trying to provoke him. Then the 3 recalled Chris's warning not to touch the hero until class began, and the bully apologized sarcastically. After that, they invited Daniel to join them so they could head to the divine power class together. Not wanting to continue interacting with these unpleasant people, Daniel ordered them to be quiet, but one of them, still defiant, reminded him that, because of his origin and status, the master would certainly use the hero for training. The bully never even saw the fist coming toward his face. Daniel rushed at his aggressor and delivered a powerful punch to his jaw. Flames seemed to envelop his body as he watched his classmate fly backward from the impact. At that moment, Daniel remembered that Daniel had already told them to keep quiet, unwilling to tolerate such insolent behavior. The two remaining attackers rushed at the hero. He closed his eyes and focused on his chi. After that, a blue flame flickered in his eyes. Now the opponent's movements became completely predictable to him. He dodged the first strike, grabbed the blonde boy's arm, and with a slight motion threw him off balance. Daniel then released his opponent, who fell to his knees, screaming in pain. The other attacker, furious at what had happened, tried to strike the hero from behind while he was distracted. However, Daniel suddenly turned and simply seized the attacker's fist, squeezing it tightly. Realizing something was wrong, the young man begged the hero to stop, but Daniel continued to squeeze until the boy collapsed to the ground in agony. In less than a minute, Daniel had neutralized all three aggressors, yet even without these bullies, he still felt like a nobody, as if the blood in his veins had not yet awakened. He remembered how his mother, in a fit of rage, smashed a flower vase and screamed. She shouted that it could not be true, that he was not her son, and blamed him for ruining her life. She added that if that were the case, she might as well kill him right then. Terrified, Daniel hurried out of the house. His father was already waiting at the door. Through tears, Daniel told him that his mother was threatening to kill him and begged his father to save him. But his father ignored the plea and walked away. The protagonist was desperate and begged his father not to leave and to listen, but it was too late. His mother caught up to him, grabbed him by the hair and dragged him away. Daniel felt unwanted by everyone. In his previous life, he had done everything he could to be accepted by his family, but now he decided to act differently. Clenching his fists, he vowed not to waste his new life on empty aspirations. He intended to build his own strength and humiliate anyone who tried to look down on him. That night, the hero went to a place not far from the school. There, the master told Daniel that the divine source art had been created using the forces of chaos and that it revealed itself most clearly when the body was pushed to its limits. As Daniel struggled to balance the massive stone on his back, he wondered if things truly had to be this way. The master shook his head in disappointment and said the student must still have plenty of strength left if he was able to speak. A little later, Daniel slowly circled the stone and finally reached the top. When the master saw Daniel resting, he twirled his fan and began tapping the student with it, demanding that he rest while standing. Daniel wondered whether the master wanted him dead, but he did not argue. He had no strength left to do so. The system notified the hero that he had reached the second level of the divine source and completed the first main task. As a reward, he received the Ring of Origin, which immediately appeared on his hand. The master explained that the ring was an exclusive artifact of their combat school and advised him to put it on as quickly as possible. Daniel slipped the ring onto his finger at once, and the system recognized it as an S-class ring. After reading the information about it, Daniel looked at the ring again, barely able to believe what he saw. Unable to hold back, he asked if he truly deserved to wear such an artifact. The old man thought it was a foolish question, because this ring was the treasured heirloom of the School of Origin. Moving on to the next reward, Daniel uncovered information about new paths. When he saw the infinite path of earthly sorrows, he assumed it must be connected to the master, but when he turned to ask, he discovered the teacher had already disappeared. This made the hero pause, realizing that choosing a path required careful thought. He decided this was a decision that demanded deep consideration. Later, when he returned home, the hero reflected on what had happened. He ultimately chose the path of endless earthly sorrows, a path of unknown class. The old man, perceiving the student's choice, wondered why Daniel had selected that particular path when others seemed better. Daniel explained that it simply felt the most suitable for him, and he was also intrigued by the direction called absorbing the heavens and earth. The elder hoped Daniel would not regret his choice, but regardless, the hero could follow no other way than the one set by his master. At that moment, the old man recalled recent events. When Daniel encountered his aggressors, they had mentioned going to lessons at the Divine Power sect. In the end, the master asked the hero what kind of divine power sect those youths, whom he had recently defeated, were talking about. Daniel reported that this sect taught martial arts to the Huangfu family. The teacher then asked if that was The master then asked the student if this meant he still had not mastered the martial arts of the Huangfu school. Daniel explained that he had not, because he had not inherited the ability. Children of the awakened have a 95% chance of inheriting their parents' skills. These children are born with mastery of meditation. The remaining 5% are born with strength surpassing that of their parents. One such child was the Dragon Sword of the Iron Blood School, whose family had passed down the Nonggung sect's martial art for generations. Society regarded that family as extraordinarily gifted geniuses. The old man was displeased by what he heard, calling it pure nonsense. In his era, martial arts were not hereditary. Realizing the situation, the master concluded that the hero's father had abandoned him precisely because he lacked inherited abilities. Daniel, unwilling to hide the truth, admitted it outright, but the master immediately objected, declaring that such an idea was complete absurdity. He stated that a man like that had no right to be called a father. After these words, the elder praised the hero, patted him on the shoulder, and reassured him. He declared that he would now be Daniel's teacher, which meant he would pass on all his knowledge of martial arts. Daniel's father had once told his son that he would never be able to have friends and that he himself could never be anyone's friend. With a dark expression, he demanded that Daniel remember this, claiming he was worthless. Now touched by the master's words, Daniel smiled and felt hope for the first time. Afterward, he wanted to know about the teacher's past and asked why everyone only spoke of him in whispers. The old man, hiding behind his fan, said with embarrassment that he had committed many sins and was therefore forced to live in solitude. Daniel guessed that the master might be a villain, but hoped he was not leading some sort of secret cult. The master grew furious at such accusations and began striking the hero, demanding that he never call him a villain again. During training, the old man noticed that modern awakened were far weaker than most warriors of his own time. They merely polished their skills without understanding the true essence of martial arts. Daniel took a deep breath, pivoted on his foot and pushed against the ground, completing the exercise. The master promised that his student would achieve enlightenment through martial arts and would become the second strongest man in history. Daniel struck the training dummy hard, leaving a deep dent. A moment later, the dummy split into two pieces. Hearing the teacher's words, Daniel asked to pause and wanted to know why he would only be second. The master proudly replied that he himself was first, and Daniel did not argue. The old man closed his fan and suggested moving on to the next stage of training, the most difficult test, one that skirted the edge of life and death. Daniel wondered where such a trial would take place, but soon an ominous premonition arose in his mind. He tried to discuss it with the teacher, but the master simply asked if he knew of any place where the strongest masters gathered. After some time, they arrived at the main school building. The master asked where Daniel was headed, and he explained that it was the green zone. The entrance lay in the basement, and awakening below level C was forbidden because of the danger. The Murama school monitored this, and rumors said the director himself had sealed the entrance. As Daniel descended the stairs, he pointed to the door covered in seals. As expected, the next passage was locked, but the master was not surprised, and said the fifth seal could be broken easily if Daniel followed instructions. With some effort, Daniel broke the seal and stepped through the door. Looking back, he could not hide his surprise at his own success. Suddenly, Daniel noticed something strange and turned immediately. A massive portal appeared before them. Alarmed, he began to remove his shackles, prompting the old man to ask sternly what he was doing. Daniel explained that he wished to leave them behind, but his teacher had forbidden even the thought of it. He was forced to put the heavy shackles back on, knowing survival in that place would be difficult without them. On the other side of the portal stretched an endless desert. The master reassured his student, noting that they were alone there. Now it was time to pass his skills on to Daniel. At first, the hero did not understand what was happening to him, but soon the system explained everything. He immediately mastered the Celestial King Step technique, a rank B skill. The hero was overjoyed. The old man warned that enemies would arrive almost on cue. He advised preparing for battle, as the fire foxes had joined the fray. The master explained that this was the Celestial King Step, developed by the masters of the Huangbo clan, and based on pure physical strength. The technique was not complicated, but required powerful legs. He asked the hero to demonstrate the newly acquired skills. 3 firefoxes charged at the hero all at once. Thanks to his skills, however, he managed to dodge every attack. Even so, the beast's strikes were so fast that he barely had time to react. The teacher instructed him to use the Celestial King's step technique, take 2 steps to the right and then bend backward as far as possible. Daniel immediately stepped twice to the right, and one of the foxes charged straight at him. He bent backward as far as he could, and the fox sailed right over him. Sensing a perfect opportunity, Daniel struck the creature with full force, knocking it out of the fight instantly. He could hardly believe his success. He had just killed a monster of the green zone with his own hands. The old man, hidden behind his fan, called the hero a braggart. At that moment, Daniel felt something was wrong, and a new shadow appeared before him. The master warned that it was not over yet. As Daniel turned, he saw the enormous jaws of another firefox. Proud of having defeated the first, he had forgotten that 3 still remained. He dodged so hastily that he was struck. Realizing he had been overconfident and had celebrated too early, Daniel barely escaped an inglorious end. As the fox attacked again, he tried to evade but was too slow. Once more, danger loomed close. One fox lunged from behind, but Daniel leapt backward to avoid the blow, only to feel a threat from the other side. He had to twist away from the airborne fox, wondering when the enemy had appeared behind him. The hero barely escaped one fox when another seized the moment and stalked from the rear. Of course, the teacher told him when to dodge, but dodging alone was not enough to win. Before death could claim him, Daniel reached rank D and continued training diligently. At that time he had thought himself strong enough to fight, but now the situation was critical again. While Daniel drifted into hopeless thoughts, his teacher shouted for him to focus. The master placed a hand on his shoulder and said he would definitely succeed. Daniel only needed to stop despairing and keep practicing the Celestial King's step, waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel followed the instructions. He tore a strip from his clothing and wrapped the wound, knowing he had to cast aside all foolish thoughts. The 3 firefoxes charged once more as he struggled to calm himself. Daniel lunged at one of them and attacked, realizing he would now need to use both the Divine Source technique and the Celestial King's step together in battle. After some time, Daniel wondered how many hours he had been fighting. By his count, nearly 6 hours had passed, leaving him completely exhausted. Yet the 3 foxes were also worn out. They were now more defensive than aggressive. If any strength remained, he would use the leg technique to restore his Divine Source ability. At that moment he could barely move, relying only on sheer willpower, but he would not give up or die there. The master declared that the time had come to strike the weakened enemies. With the last of his strength, Daniel asked his mentor for a second to catch his breath. The teacher responded with a rhetorical question: who would recover first, Daniel or the enemy? He urged Daniel to trust in the restorative power of the Divine Source, noting it was also a perfect chance to increase his endurance and strength. Though reluctant, Daniel agreed. As he prepared to attack the foxes, energy surged through his body once again, and his eyes burned with fire. Everything was going perfectly. The teacher praised his wise decision and promised to teach him a new technique after his victory, a lesson Daniel desperately needed. As he approached the foxes, one of them leapt first. With a quick motion, Daniel knocked it out with an uppercut. He smiled, confident that his teacher would keep his promise. Suddenly he sensed danger, and ducked just in time, a fireball grazing his hair. During the final assault, a fox crept up from behind and launched another stream of fire, preparing for a second strike. It seemed certain that the second blast would hit its target, but at the last instant Daniel vanished. The fox looked around in confusion. In that moment, Daniel appeared directly above it, gathering all his strength. He dropped onto the fox and struck it with his fist. After killing the creature, his Divine Source ability advanced to 3 stars. Immediately all his energy reserves were replenished. His stamina, which had fallen below 10%, was fully restored. As a reward for his remarkable growth, Daniel received 25,000 martial arts tree points. Daniel had gained additional martial skills. In addition, his divine origin technique acquired a passive ability. It was fear itself that made the monsters tremble before him. The old man laughed and praised his student's talent. He admitted that no one had expected Daniel to reach the 3-star level in just 2 months, comparing him to the first disciple. Daniel asked the master about that first student. He discovered that it was his older brother. At first the hero reacted calmly, but then he immediately sensed something was wrong. Daniel asked if there had been other students before him, and how many. The old man, slightly irritated by Daniel's sudden outburst, replied that there had been 4. He then mentioned that the foxes were escaping and that Daniel should catch up to them, but the hero insisted that his mentor not get distracted. Meanwhile, as they spoke, the fire foxes had already disappeared. Realizing this, the old man explained that he had warned Daniel the foxes might run far and that he needed to pursue them while there was still a chance. Daniel cautiously asked whether the teacher had forgotten his promise. The old man snorted in displeasure and asked if the student's memory was really that poor. The master said the technique in question was called the Fist of Domination, and that it was one of the basics. Daniel asked if it was similar to the Heavenly King's Step or if it belonged to the Huangfu clan's school of techniques. The master confirmed the guess, after which Daniel said he wanted to learn it. The old man handed him the Class B technique, the Fist of Domination, but Daniel did not seem satisfied. He wondered aloud what others would say if a person without any heritage became a clan master and surpassed everyone else. After some time, Daniel continued his journey under the scorching desert sun. He tried to spot any movement around him and asked where the monsters had gone. Hearing this, the displeased master reminded him that he had already said they should have finished earlier. Daniel quickened his pace and recalled that he had already apologized. Suddenly he stopped, noticing something ahead. The master reported that they had probably almost reached the foxes. Daniel frowned and turned to his teacher with a question. He asked if they were searching for 4-tailed monsters and the master confirmed it. Daniel then pointed forward. They were near a small oasis. 3 fire foxes stood beside a blue fox. The master confirmed that a stronger monster was among them, but Daniel was not as enthusiastic as his teacher. It was the blue fox, the boss of this level, whose lair was known as the Blue Fox's Nest. In terms of speed, it was comparable to the monsters of the Red Zone, and in terms of strength it was far superior. Even several awakened beings of rank C could not handle it. The creature before them was beyond the reach of ordinary foxes, and the slightest mistake could cost them their lives. The old man, however, advised the hero not to be afraid. He said that nothing is more valuable for growth than life and death situations. Daniel wondered at that moment whether he could truly defeat the blue fox. Even in the face of danger, he doubted that the enemy could greatly hinder his growth, but any second of hesitation meant death. If he gave up and fled now, he would be no different from a weak and pitiful person. He remembered a moment from his past when he was a child. A scream of pain echoed through the room. The wall was splattered with fresh blood, and Daniel struggled to breathe despite the agony. His opponent gave him no respite, beating him and stomping hard on his face. Satisfied with himself, the attacker said that now that Daniel had lost his reserve of shak, he would no longer be able to fight. Daniel was shocked and asked Chris why he was doing this, but Chris replied that the master himself had given permission. Daniel could hardly believe what he heard. Chris added that according to the teacher, a useless student could be beaten as much as anyone wished. At that moment, Daniel promised himself that he would become stronger to avenge his family. He had already faced death once and no longer knew what to fear. After gathering his thoughts, Daniel told the master that he was ready. As soon as he took a few steps forward, the red fox sensed him and awoke. The effect of the passive fear ability from the divine source was triggered. The 3 fire foxes trembled in terror until the blue fox stepped in front of them. A single step from the blue fox completely dispelled the hero's fear effect. The red foxes stopped trembling and were ready to attack again. All because of the blue fox's commanding presence, which doubled the fire fox's speed. Daniel had not expected that the fear effect would not always work. The presence of the blue fox was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the blue fox prepared for battle, its body blazing. Soon its entire form was wrapped in bright blue flames. Daniel informed the master that he was entering the fight. However, Daniel felt uncomfortable as there was no response from his mentor. He looked around again, but no one was nearby. Sometime earlier, Chris had gone to his father with a request. Chris's father asked if he truly wanted to compete with Daniel, and Chris answered yes. He felt that the shame Daniel was bringing upon the family could not go unpunished. The father asked who had given the order, and Chris hesitantly admitted that it had been his own decision. His father assured him that he would not scold him and demanded the truth. Chris was afraid to meet his father's eyes. That sharp, penetrating gaze was like a sword. This was the power of an awakened family of level AA. Terrified, Chris finally confessed that the order had come from his aunt. The father was a little surprised to learn that the command came from Daniel's own mother, but he quickly realized that she wanted Daniel gone. He explained that in their world only the strongest survive, and there should be no weaklings in their clan. Such people simply needed to be eliminated. Meanwhile, in the Blue Fox's lair, the oasis palm tree was wrapped in flames and everything around it burned. Daniel could barely move as the entire area was engulfed in fire, making it extremely difficult to breathe. Yet the foxes nearby seemed unaffected by the flames, which infuriated the hero. He tried to suppress his panic and focus on his actions. His martial arts knowledge left much to be desired, but he did understand creatures and monsters. Still, theory was always different from practice, and he had nearly been burned alive just moments ago. He realized that if he killed the large fox, the smaller ones would flee, which meant he would have to destroy the blue fox with a single blow. Daniel charged toward the leader, leapt into the air, dodged the blue fox's next attack, and struck. But at the moment of impact, the fox vanished. Suddenly, Daniel could not figure out where it had gone. A sudden sense of deadly danger and the heat of blue flames flared behind him. Daniel crossed his arms to block the attack as best he could. But then his teacher ordered him to use the Heavenly King step immediately. Following the advice, Daniel moved swiftly around the blue fox. He grabbed its tail and hurled it into the air. He leapt upward and gathered his strength for the final strike. Then he asked the blue fox if it thought he would simply give up and die there. Immediately after, an explosion erupted from the clash between the hero and the fox leader. After the attack, the hero was thrown to the ground, blood covering him. He smiled, thinking that after such an event he might not survive next time. The system notified him that he had defeated the boss. For his effectiveness in battle, he received 500,000 martial arts points. In addition, he was awarded a Class B magic stone and a Class A vampire spell. The teacher laughed and remarked that these were excellent rewards. The Class A vampire spell allowed the user to drain an enemy's health and was the best way to rapidly increase the hero's power. Daniel approached his master, who asked what he wanted to know. Unfortunately for the teacher, Daniel asked where the master had gone immediately after the fight. Daniel explained that he had been calling for the teacher and thought he had been abandoned as useless. The old man cleared his throat and assured Daniel that he would never abandon his student or consider him worthless. On the contrary, Daniel looked at his own hand, the hand that had killed the monster with a single blow. The master advised him to bind the vampire spell as soon as possible, adding that if Daniel listened, his abilities would grow faster. The hero asked if that was really true, and the teacher wondered if Daniel thought he was a liar. Daniel admitted he did not. At that moment, he opened the book containing the vampire spell and immediately learned the Class A spell. The teacher said it was wonderful and that only one thing remained. He pointed his fan at the hero's chest and ordered him to drain the life of all the monsters on that level. A little later, the story shifted to the hero's home. Standing in his room while changing clothes, Daniel accessed the system and opened his status screen. His title had changed from failure to the master's last disciple. He had almost reached level C and already possessed 3 abilities. With that realization, tears of happiness welled in his eyes. The old man asked what had happened, but Daniel replied that it was nothing. Meanwhile, the students hurried to avoid being late for class, and the hero walked slowly behind them. The teacher wondered why he was moving so sluggishly, and Daniel thought that he would not arrive on time anyway. Hearing this, the master shouted in his ear that such behavior was unacceptable. He should be eager for knowledge. Daniel simply smiled. Daniel said that all he needed was one teacher. For a moment the master froze, then understood exactly what Daniel meant. He agreed that a good mentor in life is enough. Suddenly someone called out to the hero and asked if he was going to class. He turned and saw Chris and his companion standing in front of him. Chris noticed that Daniel looked very happy and warned him not to push his luck, advising him to stay on his own path. Chris wondered where Daniel had gained such audacity, especially since the competition would begin tomorrow. The old man asked what competition they were talking about, and Daniel realized the master still did not know about it. While the hero explained, Chris asked what he was mumbling about and whether he knew the rules of decency. Daniel found it amusing because it was Chris who had once said he would hit first and talk later. Chris was clearly displeased by the remark. Suddenly he heard his own companions laughing behind him. Clenching his fists, he shouted that they couldn't treat him that way. He immediately rushed toward the hero, but Daniel managed to dodge. Chris was impressed by his agility and began attacking from all sides, trying to land a hit, but Daniel was too quick and evaded every strike. To make matters worse, that little mouse even laughed at him. While Chris continued his unsuccessful attacks, Daniel received a side mission to give Chris a beating. Daniel had originally planned to deal with Chris during the competition, but since the situation had changed, he decided on a different plan. As a result, the protagonist tricked Chris, causing him to stumble and fall to the ground. Looking up, Chris saw Daniel standing over him. Daniel smiled and said that Chris was completely helpless. Furious at being humiliated and realizing Daniel was using a special technique, Chris lost his composure. He jumped up and tried to crush Daniel with a powerful strike, but something happened that shocked everyone present. Daniel stopped Chris's fist simply by extending his palm. Chris struggled to understand what was happening and why he could not move his hand. He demanded to know what Daniel was doing and ordered him to let go. Daniel agreed and released him, but even after that, the pain in Chris's arm did not fade. Regaining partial control, Chris cried out in pain and fell to his knees. Daniel approached and said that he understood what Chris had been trying to do. He then asked if these actions had been ordered by Chris's relatives. After that, Daniel kicked Chris and told him that he could no longer humiliate him as before. For everything Chris had done, he would receive full retribution. Terrified, Chris asked what exactly Daniel planned to do. Tears streamed down his face as he begged the hero not to hurt him. Sometime later at the school, Daniel was pleased to have completed the mission, and 100,000 points were added to his score. Hearing the hero's laugh, someone asked if he was laughing. Daniel cleared his throat and said he was not, but the nearby teacher noticed that he was indeed laughing mischievously. During questioning, the hero was asked if he understood the consequences of his actions. After all, he had destroyed the K reservoir, and this was not just any student, it involved a member of an awakened family. Daniel replied that he had acted according to the charter. However, the prosecutor demanded to know exactly where in the charter such actions were permitted. Daniel referred to Article 1, Section 4, which states that a student has the right to defend himself if he feels under mortal threat. After verifying the article, the prosecutor angrily realized that Daniel was correct. He wanted to appeal to the president, but the president raised his hand to stop him, agreeing that this could indeed be considered self-defense. Nevertheless, the president asked what Daniel planned to do next. Chris belonged to an awakened family, and it was unlikely that things would end so easily. Seated before the hero was Hank, the president of Murin Military School and heir of the Jam family. Daniel sensed Hank's powerful aura, realizing it belonged to someone of high rank. Daniel then informed the president that this was not their problem, since he himself came from an awakened family and was the heir of its chief. Therefore, such matters should be settled within their own families. After those words, Daniel heard people around him whispering, impressed by his resolve. Hank noted that none of the other students except Sword Dragon could withstand his aura. In the end, the hearing concluded in the hero's favor. Those who had witnessed his confrontation with Chris began discussing how strong he was. One of the teachers approached Mr. Carter, reminding him that the hearing was over, but Carter replied that he still had matters to attend to. As soon as the door closed, Carter slammed his fist on the table and began plotting against the hero. He had planned to use the hearing. Carter planned to gain control over the disciples, money, gifts, and the training resources of the awakened families, but one renegade suddenly destroyed all of his plans. If things continued this way, his schemes could be completely ruined. Fearing the loss of support from wealthy families, Carter decided he needed to get rid of Daniel at any cost. After the hearing, Daniel heard people around him discussing how he had defeated the tyrant Chris. Daniel thought that if the hearing had gone badly, it could have become a serious problem, but he managed to win thanks to a divine origin technique. The master said this was natural since Daniel had already been judged by the leaders of the 9 great sects and the 5 great families. Thinking it over, Daniel concluded that the hearing had probably been initiated by Carter, the class teacher. Carter had very close ties with the heads of the awakened families, and after the incident with Chris, he might have damaged those connections. Suddenly, Daniel heard a voice outside. Carter was apologizing for what had happened, and admitted that he had insisted on the hearing, but everything had fallen apart. He also explained that funding might suddenly be cut, which was highly undesirable. Carter begged for another chance, and promised to set things right during the upcoming class competition. From what Daniel overheard, he understood that the school had decided to hold a competition between the classes instead of a general tournament for everyone. The old master asked why Daniel was so hated by his own family, saying it couldn't be just because of his abilities. Daniel replied that he had simply been unlucky, that his aunt truly hated him and was furious because his father loved his mother so deeply. The master was surprised to hear this. If Daniel was born to a woman his father loved, why did the man not love his own son? Daniel explained that his father loved his broader family far more than he loved his wife. For the sake of the family, his father was ready to sell his soul. The master agreed that the protagonist had indeed been unlucky, but Daniel reminded him that such sympathy brought no comfort. He had long since grown used to this kind of life, both in the past and now. His relatives had done everything they could to drag him down, but he was no longer the same. Daniel smashed the pot to the ground in anger and walked away, confident that his family could no longer break him. The next day in the school gymnasium, the day of the competition arrived. Many students whispered as Daniel, the very student who had silenced Chris, walked by. Everyone wondered how strong this young man was, and how someone of rank D could change so dramatically. Covering himself with his fan, the old master asked whose student Daniel was, since he was drawing so much attention. Carter noticed the students talking and ordered them to be quiet and head to class. When everyone had gathered, Carter announced that he would stage a simulated battle with a monster. As always, the enemy would be generated randomly, but its level would match that of the students. Just like the portals to other worlds, these simulations were dangerous, because the administrator sets the level and anything can happen inside. When it was the hero's turn, the teacher intended to push the difficulty to the maximum, and then call it a system error. The day of the competition was the perfect moment to finally get rid of this troublesome boy. The old master noticed the murderous intent on Carter's face, and was shocked that such a man had become a teacher. Daniel, realizing where this was heading, smiled and said he would not remain silent. Soon his turn came and he stepped into the simulation room. Professor Carter asked what kind of opponent he wanted. Daniel replied that he didn't care because he was confident in himself. Carter then asked if he was ready to fight a demon. Demons were awakened beings who had become criminals, such as those in the Death Lotus group. It was clear that Carter was no longer hiding the threat and was openly putting him to the test. Daniel agreed with a smile. After that, Carter warned that if he felt threatened, he should report it immediately. At once, the professor pressed the button. In the next moment, the mechanism began selecting the test conditions. A randomly generated snowy hill appeared, with the difficulty increased. Seconds later, Daniel found himself in real snow-covered mountains. His teacher wished him good luck, and then his voice disappeared. Daniel felt a slight unease, realizing how badly Carter wanted to destroy him. The snow limited visibility and made it difficult to navigate, indicating a high level of environmental danger. But the most important factor was the enemy, the white-browed ice villain. He was one of the highest-ranking members of the 7 villains of the Death Lotus group, a mad old man whose only pleasure was killing. This was exactly the kind of opponent the professor had chosen for his student, which seemed like madness. Yet the hero now had a new incentive, an urgent quest for Daniel's system recognized the novice's level C willpower as he used the art of divine origin. He had to defeat the demon, which would earn him 250,000 martial arts points and double the usual reward. The white-browed villain spread his arms and began gathering energy. Immediately afterward, he pressed his palms together and released an energy beam, but Daniel dodged it easily. Suddenly he sensed danger. The ice ray curved back and returned toward him, and he managed to block the strike only partially. Daniel realized this was the Ice Master technique from the Northern Ice Palace. The white-browed old man rushed toward him and appeared at his side in an instant, startling the hero. Because of the enemy's speed, Daniel had no chance to evade and was forced to block the attack. Seeing that a single blow would not kill his opponent, the villain abruptly closed the distance again. Even though this was a simulation, the enemy was incredibly strong. Daniel gathered energy in his hands, preparing to counterattack. At that moment, the old man suddenly leapt back. The hero reminded himself that it was only a simulation, but even so, his opponent's strength was overwhelming. Yet Daniel felt a genuine thrill. He savored the moment, because it was rare to face such a master. The hero concentrated energy into his fist, saturating the snow around him. Soon he had built up enough power. Summoning all his strength, he struck from behind, but the white-browed demon dodged at the last second. Daniel refused to lose the opportunity and chased after him. With every step, the distance between them shrank. When he finally closed in, Daniel prepared another strike, gathering energy once more. But as soon as he hit the target, the old man began to fade. His body dissolved under Daniel's hand like a hologram. Daniel wondered if Carter had shut down the simulation room and kicked the ground in frustration, realizing he had let himself get carried away. Meanwhile, Professor Carter was trying to understand how such a thing could happen. Somehow Daniel had managed to disrupt his own Shi's system. Even though the simulated difficulty was slightly lower, it was still at least level C. Carter admitted to himself that even an experienced student would have struggled against such a test, and it would have been difficult even for him. During this time, Daniel received a reward for the fight. Although he had not completely defeated his opponent, he was pleased to have earned a prize. In addition, he received exactly the rank credit he had aimed for. All of this was possible thanks to the Source Ring, which had enabled him to rise quickly from a useless rank F to a rank D, and even to defeat Chris. Now he was certain this would provoke the anger of his relatives. Suddenly someone called out while clenching their fists. Daniel grew wary, wondering who needed him, but when he turned he saw his classmates running toward him to praise his performance in the competition. At first Daniel was surprised, but then he smiled. Nothing like this had happened in his previous life, and he had to admit the feeling was extraordinarily pleasant. One of his comrades asked again what exactly he had said, but Daniel shyly replied that it was nothing special. The next day, an unexpected change occurred. As Daniel passed by, his bandmates greeted him as Sambe. Their behavior surprised him, and the professor watched the scene with evident irony. Before Daniel could ask, one of the students explained that it was Huse, a new student. They bowed again before Daniel and asked him to lead them. The protagonist tried to understand why these guys were greeting him as if he were the head of a criminal gang. From the expressions on their faces, it was obvious they saw him as a crime boss and wanted him to become their leader. Daniel felt awkward and asked them not to do that again, but Jose asked whether they had done something wrong. Fearing it would continue, Daniel exclaimed in frustration, wondering who he was to be called their leader. Nevertheless, the 5 disciples bowed once more and begged forgiveness in unison. Daniel could not stand it any longer and ordered them to stop behaving that way immediately. Finally reaching the classroom, he sighed in exhaustion and bid farewell to the bothersome students who had followed him all the way. The old master, stroking his beard, commented that this was the burden of the strong. Suddenly the door burst open and one of the students stormed into the classroom. He immediately challenged the hero to a duel. Daniel refused, claiming he was tired, and asked him to leave. However, the opponent would not listen. He drew his sword and attacked. Unfortunately for him, Daniel stopped the blade with his bare hands and even snapped it in two. Before the student could grasp what was happening, Daniel struck him on the head, ending the fight instantly. He advised his opponent to learn to listen to people first. The old man remarked ironically that Daniel had become quite popular. Irritated, he asked whether Daniel truly considered that popularity. Tired of the endless challenges, Daniel lay down on the desk and tried to rest for a moment. With a heavy sigh, he admitted that he was not some kind of hidden tiger. The professor observed that the other students probably just wanted to test the hero's skills in practice. Daniel objected, saying that even if that were the case, the entire school now knew what he was capable of. Soon, Carter entered the classroom, demanded silence, and asked who had been shouting during the morning assembly. Displeased, he shot Daniel a hard look, but Daniel simply turned his eyes away. Carter then stood behind the podium and announced that the students would fill out their schedules today. He would distribute forms where each student had to list their chosen classes. Daniel explained that students needed to divide their lessons into 3 areas: footwork, weapons, and combat techniques. Training was built around these 3 directions. Even focusing on just one did not guarantee mastery, and handling all 3 at once was far more difficult. These words made the hero think carefully about what to write. After some time, when everyone had filled out their forms, he approached the head student and asked whether she needed to collect them. She replied that he could give his form to her as well. While folding the papers, she accidentally saw the hero's completed sheet and was stunned. The issue was that he had written down every single subject. Later on the school sports field, the instructor noticed that class attendance was especially high that year. Her attention was soon drawn to Daniel, who stood among the students. She bowed politely to him, and he replied with only a slight nod. This instructor was Jenny, known by the nickname Scarlet Lotus Fist. She came from a level B awakened family and was famous for her fairness and independence. Even toward the family outcast Daniel, she showed respect. Jenny then announced that today they would learn the 10-step Divine Fist technique. This technique originated from the Divine Dragon Monastery, a successor to the Shaolin traditions, and the students had to start with the basics. At her signal, an assistant brought out a box. Jenny explained that inside were shackles, each weighing 20 kilograms, and ordered the students to put them on their hands. As the students began fastening the shackles, some asked whether such an exercise was truly necessary. After everyone had secured the weights, Jenny calmly explained the next step. They had to stand in a horse stance and stretch their arms forward. She strictly forbade the use of K-energy during training. One student dared to ask how long they had to remain in that position. Jenny replied that they were to stay that way for the rest of the class. 40 minutes passed. The students resisted with all their strength, but after an hour some could no longer endure and were forced to give up. By the second hour, one by one, everyone quit, except Daniel. The remaining students whispered among themselves, wondering how much longer he could last. His resilience truly surprised Jenny. She realized that Daniel's victory over the young master Chris had not been an accident or a trick, as some had believed. Approaching him, the instructor clapped her hands and announced that it was enough. Daniel was surprised, as there was still time left in the class, but Jenny explained that he had already proven his strength, and there was no need to continue the exercise. She then said she would teach him the 10-step Divine Fist technique, and handed him an instruction manual. She warned that the formulas in the book were refined and complete, but mastering them would be extremely difficult. The protagonist was amazed at how easily he was being granted access to such a precious technique. Daniel flipped through the pages eagerly. Noticing this, Jenny explained that the book had not been obtained from a dungeon. It had to be studied like any ordinary textbook with total dedication. Before the mentor could continue, Daniel set the book down, stood up, and attempted to use the Divine Fist technique. The energy that burst from his hands suddenly shot toward the instructor. At that moment, Jenny froze, but the attack missed her, merely slicing off part of her hair and ruining her hairstyle. An embarrassed Daniel admitted that he had failed. Even the system indicated that he had not mastered the technique. The old man clicked his tongue in disapproval and explained that such an art could not be mastered in a single minute. However, the master, hiding a smile behind his fan, quietly admitted to himself that this was the first time he had ever seen such talent. He had previously considered the young man to be nothing special. He had once thought Daniel was a failure, but now he saw that Daniel's abilities were gradually developing. The old man was very hopeful to soon witness the heights the boy would reach. His gift was not like the demonic kind, where knowledge is absorbed like a sponge, nor was it similar to the innate power of a celestial warrior. He could not understand how Daniel had gone from a failure to a genius, literally overnight. Meanwhile, Daniel approached Jenny and realized that he had miscalculated the amount of energy he had used, which caused the explosion. He asked if this meant that the amount of ki used had to be carefully regulated in order to perform it correctly. Surprised by his observation, Jenny confirmed and explained that he needed to learn how to control his energy reserves. But Daniel had already understood, and the girl had understood as well. Without waiting for further explanation, he once again made smooth movements. The hero then threw a powerful punch forward, releasing a wave of energy. Jenny was stunned and could not hold back a cry of surprise. Not understanding how this was possible, the hero himself, however, was satisfied. He had managed to master the technique, and the divine fist of 10 steps was now added to his list of abilities. Soon the teachers gathered around him, each trying to convince Daniel to join their school. Tired of the chaos, Daniel asked them to speak one at a time. Then, one of the mentors loudly declared that Daniel's hands were made for the spear. His movements were as natural as the flow of water. That is why he must master the divine spear art of the Zhou family. Another teacher interrupted his colleague, claiming that the path of a swordsman was the ideal for Daniel. His technique was so refined that it already rivaled the dragon sword-bearer, and therefore he should learn the iron blood techniques. Meanwhile, a third master pushed the second aside and shouted that all of this was nonsense, because Daniel was destined to become an extraordinary master of poisons. His accomplishments were already very promising, and the 10,000 Shadow Poison family would always be happy to accept him. Alarmed, the teachers even asked him to put away the vial of poison he was holding. Their argument continued, and seizing the moment, Daniel simply ran away. Not long ago, he had not even thought of joining any family, but now he could not understand why everyone was trying to persuade him. The mentor observed that this too was a kind of burden, to which Daniel asked if that was what he meant. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice. It was Jen. Daniel explained that he was only running away from the annoying teachers who were pestering him. Then the professor handed him a bottle of soda and asked whether he enjoyed the subjects he was studying. Daniel thanked him and said that he was truly interested in everything, because he was always learning something new. Then the mentor asked if all this endless training was tiring him. Daniel seemed capable of teaching others by himself. However, he abandoned the thought and simply took a sip of soda. He then explained that he had not inherited any family abilities, and therefore everything the school taught him felt valuable. According to him, this knowledge was hundreds of times better than complete ignorance. Jenny was surprised that the boy thought this way, but at that exact moment, the shouts of the teachers searching for Daniel were heard. The situation became quite unpleasant. Those 3 mentors found him very quickly, forced to flee. Daniel told Jenny that he needed to leave. Escaping from the bothersome mentors, he lifted his head toward the sky. The hero noted to himself that the weather today was truly wonderful. After some time, he found himself in the fox den, where Daniel seized the fire fox and began to drain its life force. From the small amount of magical energy this move gave him, he gained only 1 point of endurance. Although the fox died, fire foxes continued to appear all over the cave. This meant that he could return here from time to train, though the reward for the time spent was clearly very small. The worst part was that after the first clearing, no more magic stones appeared in the den. Daniel then asked the professor if he was ready to start absorbing the power of the magic stone. The old man answered negatively, but then added that he had an idea. According to him, Daniel's growth was much faster than he had expected, which meant it was time to raise the stakes. The mentor asked if the student had noticed the dense energy, and what would happen if he drew it in using a vampire ability. Daniel was shocked and asked again if that was even possible. After all, the amount of energy generated by the dungeon was enormous, and if he managed to absorb it, it would be a kind of panacea. But the professor explained that the vampire ability alone, she would not have been capable of it. However, Daniel possessed a divine origin art. Even so, the mentor warned that the young man's body was already filled with the energy of the creatures he had previously absorbed. If he risked absorbing such a colossal amount of power in his current state, the chances of falling ill were 90%. Daniel replied with a mischievous smile that otherwise, what would be the point of coming this far in training if he stopped now? With those words, he sat down to meditate and began absorbing the surrounding energy. Surprisingly, he managed to successfully absorb the dungeon's power, causing his vampire ability and origin arts to rise to 4 stars. However, such a monstrous flow of energy caused him intense pain, and the veins of his body began to swell painfully. When Daniel had used the divine origin technique for the first time, the old man nearly fainted with anxiety. But now the student himself was struggling to overcome the first obstacle. After completing the meditation, he opened his eyes, in which blue lights began to shine once again. Then the hero collapsed exhausted to the ground. The master asked him how he was feeling. Breathing heavily, Daniel replied that it felt as though he had returned from the other world. The mentor only laughed. If the student had enough strength left to make jokes, then he had succeeded. The system confirmed that the reconfiguration was complete, and Daniel's stat limits had been altered. The young man tried to block the system notifications, but they continued appearing before his eyes. Suddenly he noticed something in common. Having absorbed the dungeon's energy, he had become the first to clear the den. Because of this, he received another 250,000 points, and in addition, the right to possess the Blue Fox Den. He had never heard of a dungeon master before, neither in the news nor in school. Suddenly a creaking sound was heard nearby. Surprised, Daniel asked his mentor if he had made the noise, but the old man dismissed him, called him a fool, and told him to turn around. Turning, the young man saw a small blue fox. Daniel could not hold back a cry of joy. The little creature was incredibly cute. Now he understood what the system messages had meant. The teacher noticed that this fox produced an enormous amount of energy, and when it grew it would have 10 tails. Hearing this, Daniel felt uneasy, imagining what kind of creature the beast would become. The mentor asked what name he would give his new pet. After thinking for a moment, the boy suggested calling her Sinfafka. The master was nearly speechless, and asked again if that was really the best name the student could come up with. Unable to argue further, the mentor resigned himself and agreed to the chosen name. Daniel then asked Sinfafka if she liked the name, pressed her against his face, and offered to be her friend. Meanwhile, the story shifted back to the academy. At that moment, President Henk was cleaning the leaves of a plant in his office. Suddenly, his secretary rushed in and shouted that an emergency had occurred. Henk calmly asked her what had happened. The girl replied that it was about the Blue Fox Slayer dungeon, the one to which the school's portal led. The problem was, it had been cleared. Arriving at the site, Henk was shocked at what he saw. The seal of the 5 elements, which was considered impenetrable, had been destroyed. Rudd had once taken pride in his ability to cast this trap that no force or technique could break. Henk wanted to see with his own eyes what was happening. So he opened the gate. Immediately a system notification appeared before his eyes. It stated that the entrance to the Blue Fox Slayer dungeon was accessible only to its owner. Henk tried to figure out how something like this could have happened, and who exactly could have taken control of this dungeon. He then turned to his secretary, Naomi. The man gave orders to immediately find out who had cleared the dungeon. Meanwhile, the story moved forward into the night to the inn. Daniel stared at a part of the wall in his room as if he were lost in important thought. He asked his mentor if this would be enough, but the teacher replied that it was unlikely, which greatly disappointed the boy. Daniel could not understand why, because if Sinfefka lived here, they could see each other often. The mentor then explained that it would be obvious to everyone that Daniel had never had pets. The fact was, animals always sought freedom and space to wander. The teacher wondered where Sinfafka might be now, and guessing that she was in bed, turned with Daniel to look. His guess was confirmed. While they were still thinking of a place for her, the little fox had already fallen asleep on the bed. Since Sinfafka clearly liked the spot, Daniel decided to let her stay there. The mentor observed with mild satisfaction as the student interacted with his pet. As fate would have it, Daniel, he had not inherited any talent from his family. Because of this, he became an outcast, unwanted by society. It would not have been surprising if the young man's heart had been filled with darkness. However, he proved to be different. Despite the power that suddenly fell upon him, Daniel tried to remain humble. Unlike those who, upon gaining power, destroy themselves and others out of vengeance, he did not succumb to temptation. He was far better off than the fate of his first disciple, who had turned into a vengeful, bloodthirsty monster. After putting the fox to sleep, Daniel decided he had only one thing left to do that day. After reconfiguring the system, the volume of his chi reservoir had increased, causing the flow of energy to grow stronger. The only question was how much the numbers had risen. To find out, Daniel accessed the interface and opened his statistics. When he saw them, he froze in shock. The mentor, noticing the smoke of indignation rising above the student's head, was perplexed by what was happening. Daniel had not expected such results from the system, and exclaiming loudly, he called the mentor's attention to the indicators. Now all his stats had surpassed 100 and his maximum limit had risen to 300, with his internal energy reaching 452. At that time, the limit for awakened people of A level was 300 units. That was the level of the 5 emperors. It turned out that Daniel's stats now matched theirs. The young man wondered if this meant that with more advancements he would be able to reach the same level as the 5 emperors. The mentor, noticing his reaction, asked why the student looked as though he was seeing something for the first time. He advised him to use his martial arts points as soon as possible. Daniel admitted that he had forgotten he was saving them. He had accumulated quite a few points and now needed to decide exactly how to spend them. His attention was drawn to the Heavenly King's step, but the mentor told him that with his current physique, learning that technique was useless. Instead, he suggested developing the Friend of Nature trait, which would give the student 15 more points in strength. However, the mentor seemed to have forgotten about the student's curiosity. Daniel cleverly distracted him by pointing to the side and pretending to see something. The teacher looked out the window but saw nothing, only asking what was so special there. That moment was enough for Daniel to spend 650,000 points and upgrade his martial arts. Thanks to this, he mastered the Heavenly King's step and also obtained a new technique, the Infinite Spear. To avoid being deafened by his mentor's furious shouts, Daniel covered his ears in advance, but to his surprise, no scolding followed. He cautiously uncovered his ears and was stunned to see that the mentor had no intention of scolding him. On the contrary, he slowly opened his fan and with a smile said that any master worth his salt could always understand his students. Daniel felt irritated by his arrogance and decided to test the system. Due to his understanding of the Heavenly King's step, he could no longer use the technique directly. The teacher laughed and explained that the student had simply wasted an enormous amount of martial arts points. The story moved forward to the following morning. Upon waking, Daniel immediately opened his statistics again. Following his mentor's advice, he obtained the Friend of Nature effect, which increased his speed, as well as the blessing of Mother Nature. In addition, he received a new technique and a boost of 15 points in athletics, agility and stamina. However, a strange feeling arose within him, as though he had lost something. Trying to recall what they had been discussing, Daniel suddenly heard a low growl nearby. He shuddered when he realized he had forgotten to bring food for Sinka, and now she was starving. The young man apologized to the fox and promised to bring her food immediately. Since the fox was small, Daniel decided she needed milk, but when he opened the refrigerator, he discovered there was none. The little blue fox followed her master and began rubbing against his leg. Daniel realized she didn't want to let him go alone. Putting on a sweater, he carefully hid Sinfaka underneath and set out in search of food. Suddenly, Daniel heard a knock on the door. He was not expecting anyone that morning. Quickly hiding Sinfaka, he asked who it was. A female voice answered from behind the door. The stranger introduced herself as the president's secretary and asked if Daniel lived there. He opened the door, confirmed that it was indeed his room, and asked what was happening. The secretary, Naomi, informed him that the president was calling him to his office. Daniel was stunned. A summons from the president could only mean one thing. He asked his mentor for advice, and the old man agreed that the matter was probably related to the dungeon they had recently cleared. The hero then replied that he had no good reason to go to the president at that moment. However, Secretary Naomi, he calmly and politely asked her to come along, assuring her that it would only take a little time. Daniel finally agreed but imposed a condition. He wanted the secretary to buy some milk on the way. The atmosphere in President Hank's office was tense. No matter how he looked at Daniel, there was still an ordinary young man standing in front of him. Yet he couldn't understand how this youth had managed to clear the blue fox's lair alone. After all, no matter how he looked at it, Daniel wasn't stronger than a rank D. It simply seemed impossible. The old man calmly explained to the student that the man in front of him was now trying to discern his true abilities. The key point was that his origin ring concealed his potential from curious eyes. The hero then asked the president directly why he had called him. Hank replied that he suspected Daniel might be having issues with Chris. After that, he asked about Daniel's father, the famous Emperor's Fist, but the hero calmly explained that he was an outcast in his family and had no knowledge of his father's affairs. Hank immediately apologized, admitting it had been wrong to ask such a question, but Daniel's composed behavior reassured him that everything was fine. As soon as the door closed behind him, Secretary Naomi asked the president what he thought of the young man. After a pause, Hank admitted that he didn't know. He explained that he had never encountered a situation where he couldn't see a person's true abilities, and it embarrassed him greatly. However, he noted that it was necessary to contact someone as soon as possible. Returning to his room, Daniel greeted Sinfaka with a smile, saying that her master had returned. Meanwhile, the little fox happily finished the rest of the milk in her bowl. Daniel wondered if she had really been that hungry and poured her some more. Sinfaka barked joyfully. The system then informed the young man that her affection had increased by 5 points and that she was satisfied. According to the system, Sinfaka's growth progress reached 1% and her affection level had risen to 25. Daniel thoughtfully nudged the fox toward her bowl, thinking that such low statistics were due to her being recently born. He also began considering where he could place her in Akka when she grew up. The mentor reminded him that this wasn't the only problem, and Daniel had to agree. President Hank had begun to suspect him, which meant he now had to be much more careful and monitor Bison's actions. Bison was an information collector for the family. Thanks to him, the clan controlled many dungeons and artifacts. Daniel admitted that he was concerned about being watched 24 hours a day and that he needed to do something about it. The first thing he decided to do was exercise his right as the owner of the Blue Fox Lair. The professor was a little surprised that the student was thinking of this, but soon added that he had also considered such a solution. After organizing his thoughts, Daniel went to the back of the school where he usually trained. There he used the system to establish contact with the lair. After passing through the portal, he found himself once again in an oasis in the desert. The hero was convinced that he had truly entered the Blue Fox's lair. This meant he now had a private place to keep his pet when she grew up. With Daniel now protected in a hidden location away from Bison's eyes, his next step was to set his next goal. Using one of his 2 remaining attempts, he created a new portal that could be closed at any time. The portal was now ready for use. Entering it, he immediately returned to his room. Thanks to his mastery of dungeon management, one problem was solved. However, a new goal awaited Daniel to strengthen his own power. Several days passed since then. He spent all that time in the dungeon but could not increase his skill level, and the system also did not assign him any new tasks. The young man realized that after clearing the Blue Fox's lair, he would need to find a more challenging dungeon, and he already had one in mind, the Chlorine Dungeon. It was located in the Green Zone, where the Firestone artifact was kept. From his past life, Daniel remembered that it had been discovered by a monster tamer who had accidentally stumbled upon a stone. He simply gave the artifact to his pet, and the monster instantly transformed from a weak white-rank creature into a powerful blue-rank monster. Now Daniel dreamed of obtaining this stone and giving it to Sinfaka to consume, but suddenly, he was distracted by his classmates. They were talking animatedly about something in the hallway. Everyone was surprised when Holly, the ice flower, appeared at the school. However, the boys didn't understand what she was doing there. To the students' surprise, the girl went straight to the classroom where Daniel was sitting. Approaching him, she asked if his name was really Daniel. He confirmed, feeling a little embarrassed. Holly smiled and said that he knew her, as she had just entered the 6th grade. Daniel was confused and wondered what all of this meant. Holly, the eldest daughter of the Jie clan, was the heir of the Jie family. She was a rank B awakened and had earned the nickname Ice Flower. By all rights she should have been transferred to the first elite class, but she ended up in the 6th class, where only students from Class E studied. This meant that her future had taken a different path, but at first glance nothing terrible had happened. She then extended her hand to Daniel, inviting him to become friends. However, he stepped back and coldly remarked that he did not want friends and that she should not come near him. Seeing the girl's reaction, he felt uneasy. Holly barely restrained herself from striking him for his rude refusal. Daniel, covering his face with his hands, admitted to himself that he simply could not afford to be friends with her. He explained that his half-brother, known as the Dragon Fist, was keeping an eye on Holly. He said that if his brother saw them interacting, he would become furious and might try to kill him. Daniel did not understand why Holly was talking to him. The professor suggested that he had some guesses and asked about the current situation of the families. The hero explained that there was a federation of 15 great families, a martial arts federation, and the demonic Lotus of Death. The professor speculated that the Ji clan, which had inherited the martial arts of the Jium family, was the most influential. He added that he did not believe the Jium family relied solely on their own strength, but rather that these clever people absorbed talents of the modern era. Unlike other families, the Jium family was weak in martial arts but compensated by inviting the most talented to join them. So they had even attracted Ice Flower to their side and probably sent her to test Daniel. He frowned, wondering if that intimidating girl was trying to claim him. The professor explained that at this moment he was weaker than Ice Flower, which meant he had to figure out how to deceive her. But Daniel no longer wanted to listen to this kind of discussion. He firmly stated that he had no intention of communicating with Holly. Some classes later, a crowd of students gathered in the school gymnasium. The professor announced that he expected the students to be ready for the exams. He noticed a new student and suggested conducting a simulated battle, asking for volunteers. When asked who wanted to go first, someone immediately raised their hand. It was Holly. The professor approved her enthusiasm and suggested she choose an opponent. Without hesitation, she pointed at Daniel. He was clearly unhappy with the choice. Soon they drew their swords and took fighting stances. Holly asked if he was ready for the fight. Daniel admitted that he was not ready at all, and wanted to understand why she had chosen him, but there was no time for discussion. The professor gave the order to begin. In the next moment, the girl launched her attack. Before the hero could even blink, she disappeared from sight. In just an instant, she appeared in front of him and struck with a lightning-fast blow from her blade. He miraculously avoided such an unexpected attack, but Holly immediately intercepted the sword with her other hand and attacked again. This time Daniel managed to block. Their weapons clashed, neither willing to yield to the other. Due to the surge of energy, their blades separated without colliding. Daniel realized he was fighting a rank B awakened, whose strength far exceeded his expectations. Her attacks aimed to gradually wear him down. However, he still resisted, and with each strike, Holly's movements became increasingly clear to him. The hero literally predicted all her fencing techniques as if in slow motion. After only a few exchanges, he began noticing weaknesses in her iron blood style. Holly was frustrated that he had adapted to her techniques so quickly. After only a few exchanges, he was already anticipating her moves and countering her attacks. She realized that if she prolonged the fight, she would lose. So the girl decided to use a special technique. When their blades crossed again, Daniel asked if she was about to attack. Holly was shocked that he had discovered her intentions. At that moment, Daniel delivered the decisive blow. His blade barely touched her hair. In the next instant, several strands fell to the floor. After that, the girl silently sheathed her sword. She had no other choice and admitted defeat. Since then she had often been lost in thought, but her condition did not escape the protagonist's notice. He realized that she was confused after the fight and wondered if it had really been. It came as a shock to her. At that moment, the professor asked Daniel why he had cut her hair and what would happen if the girl considered it an insult. Daniel explained that it had all happened by accident. The professor reminded them that, in the future, the Ji family and the Iron Blood Sword clan would be their main opponents. One day they would unite and act against them. Therefore, Daniel should consider the possibility of becoming friends with them. After classes, Daniel went to the dormitory to see Senka. However, on the way he suddenly heard Holly calling him. She approached him and asked if he was free. Daniel replied that he had nothing to do. The girl then invited him to dinner, and he, feeling slightly embarrassed, agreed. He could not understand what was happening. It seemed like she was planning to kill him. For dinner, they went to a pizzeria. Holly grabbed a slice and bit into it with delight, commenting on how delicious it was. Daniel looked at her and thought she had a wonderful appetite. He even doubted whether the pizza was really that good and hesitated to try it. Noticing that he had not touched his food, Holly asked why he was not eating. Daniel tried to think of an answer but eventually admitted that he did not even know why they were there. Holly then took a slice of pizza and commented that he was being too stubborn. Daniel was surprised and wondered what she meant. She explained that she had bought the best pizza for him, and he was acting like a stubborn fool. After finishing their meal, Holly wiped her mouth and said it was time to get down to work. She asked how Daniel had managed to defeat her. He replied that he had noticed her weaknesses, which greatly surprised her. Daniel explained that she had a good sword, but she was inexperienced and uncomfortable with it. This allowed him to detect several weak points in her attacks and exploit them. Holly, impressed by his explanation, asked if he had really understood all of that in such a short time during their fight. Daniel admitted that he himself did not fully know it had all happened instinctively. He added that he had answered her questions and hoped she was not offended by her haircut. To his surprise, Holly asked why she should be offended. She even admitted that she liked updating her hairstyle and truly enjoyed having short hair. That same night, the sound of a broken lamp and furious shouting was heard at the Lee residence. Chris, lying in a pool of blood with a shard of glass in his hand, screamed that he would tear Daniel's legs off. The servant, fearing for the young master, begged him to calm down and attend to the cut, but Chris's eyes filled with tears as he demanded to know what he meant. He then struck the servant in the face with the shard and asked furiously if he thought him a pathetic weakling. After all, it was just a silly cut from glass, and the servant dared to try to calm him. Chris was enraged because his she reservoir had been destroyed by some madman. He picked up the shard intending to kill the servant, but his hand was stopped just in time. It was his father. The man calmly asked his son to calm down. Chris threw himself into his father's arms and began to cry. His father told him not to be afraid and, lightly squeezing his hand, promised to heal his K reservoir. He said he would give him an artifact called the Fire Stone, which had incredible fire power. If Chris absorbed it, he would recover quickly. The young man, enchanted, hugged his father again and thanked him. However, suddenly, his father's face twisted with anger. He swore that he would make Daniel regret what he had done to his son. Sometime later, the hero was walking through the school. At one point he decided to go to the bathroom. One of the spies, Bison, immediately reported this and received orders to continue observing. Minutes dragged on. 40 had already passed and the target was still in the bathroom. The man on the other end of the earpiece wondered if Daniel had escaped. Without waiting for further orders, Bison hurried to check as it seemed very suspicious. However, he was immediately reminded that when under surveillance, Bison agents were prohibited from revealing their presence. Despite this, he was already reaching for the bathroom door handle. At that exact moment, the door suddenly opened. Daniel accidentally hit him with it. Bison fell to his knees in pain, covering his face with his hands. Since the man was not seriously injured, Daniel apologized and ran to class. Once he left, Bison was questioned if he was too careless, and he could only apologize for almost revealing himself. However, Daniel had already realized that he was being followed. He told the professor that he had almost been caught and noticed that this time, the pursuer had stayed for much longer. The professor said that was enough time, and Daniel agreed. These Bison clan members had no idea. Nothing. In fact, his absence was explained by the fact that he was passing through the portal to sell the accumulated magical stones. He thanked himself for his foresight and for placing the portals in the right locations in advance. Then the professor asked if the deal was legitimate, which left the hero in a deadlock. He recalled that he had signed all the documents with his real name. The contract stated that he was giving the Federation of the Great Families access to his data. The hero's signature was on the document, and the bank itself belonged to the shock troops. The main character was very pleased about this. For him, it was even a convenient way to confuse them further. Moreover, the Class B magical stone he sold was unusual. Such stones could only be obtained in the dungeons of the Blue Zone. Knowing this, he couldn't help but laugh, imagining how everyone would be puzzled over how this newcomer had managed to get his hands on such an artifact. A little later, in the school cafeteria, several students approached Daniel. One of them asked if they could sit next to him, but suddenly a tray fell on the table beside him, and the students heard a harsh order to leave. With a stern look, Holly announced that the seat was taken. Frightened, the students apologized and quickly left. After that, the girl sat down next to him as if nothing had happened and took the rashes. Daniel asked why she had scared the students, to which Holly replied that she didn't like having too many people around. Daniel said that perhaps he also felt uncomfortable around others, and that he might not feel happy sitting next to her. But Holly didn't care what he thought. The protagonist was intrigued by her impenetrable demeanor. To prevent something like this from happening again, he decided to simply ignore her and not bring up the matter. However, as soon as Daniel started eating, Holly caught his attention. She asked which techniques he was studying besides the 3 fundamental ones. Daniel was surprised and asked why she needed to know. In response, she noted that no one with only 3 basic techniques could demonstrate such power. Daniel asked Holly if she truly thought that way. However, he didn't want to continue the conversation, so he said he was already fed up and still had things to do. After that, the hero stood up and headed toward the exit of the dining hall. Holly watched him leave in silence. Shortly afterward, the class professor Carter announced to the students that they would have a practical lesson the following week. One student raised their hand and asked exactly where it would take place. In response, Carter explained that they had 3 options to choose from. The first, the secret treasure; the second, the beach of despair; and the last, the infernal cave. The students began whispering excitedly, discussing where they would like to go as all 3 dungeons seemed tempting. Daniel already knew in advance where he wanted to go and chose the infernal cave. However, it happened too quickly, almost as if it were too convenient, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder if it was a coincidence. Meanwhile, Holly continued to stare at him. He simply couldn't help noticing her attention. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he asked what she wanted from him. But instead of answering, the girl threw him a piece of paper, asking him not to pay attention to her and assuring him that she was merely observing. Daniel clenched the paper in irritation. He was already fed up with that girl and her multi-dimensional personality. On his way home, he flopped onto his bed. He had no strength left, and all these strange people around him were exhausting him. One of them always bowed to him, showering him with praise, and the other watched him. Then he heard the voice of his mentor, who said that this is the burden of the strong. But Daniel objected. Why should the strong bear all of this? In response, the professor exploded, releasing his anger and scolding the student for being insolent. But suddenly, Daniel realized something was missing. He told the mentor that Sinka wasn't around, because she always greeted him when he returned. The mentor admitted that it was strange, but suggested that the animal was simply napping in the corner. Daniel became worried and began searching for the animal throughout the house. He looked in every corner until he finally checked under the bed. What he saw there horrified him. Azul had curled up into a ball, trembling and whining pitifully. The next day, Daniel sat on a bench outside the school, holding his backpack in his lap. He opened it and quietly apologized to the pet for not letting it go out earlier. Now it was free to go out and look around. Azul crawled out and barked happily. The night before, Daniel had already taken it and placed it next to him on the bed. After that, the hero checked the interface. Everything seemed normal, except that Sinka's magical energy was almost depleted. That was why the little animal had become ill. Daniel comforted it and promised to take care of it. He reached out his hand to transfer his power, but before he could do so, the mentor intervened and asked exactly what he intended to do. When he learned that Daniel wanted to share his energy, the mentor firmly forbade it. He explained that if Senavika suddenly rejected someone else's power, things would only get worse. Alarmed, Daniel asked what he should do. The mentor then explained that Senovika was not such a weak creature and could easily wait for the training as long as Daniel took him along. While petting his animal, Daniel asked him to be patient. Fortunately, the teacher managed to feed the animal using a little magic. Now the fox was feeling better. Daniel encouraged his pet, assuring it that they would definitely be healed at the gate. Suddenly he heard a strange voice, and reacting instantly he hid Senovika back in his backpack. Out of nowhere, Holly appeared in front of him, startling him with her sudden appearance. Daniel asked if she wasn't going to board the bus. She replied that she would only get on once she saw him enter. Realizing he had no choice, Daniel reluctantly agreed. As he was entering the bus, someone noticed him again. It turned out to be one of the students the hero had met before. The young man introduced himself as Jose and asked Daniel to teach him the practice. Daniel was surprised. The name sounded familiar, as if he had heard it before. He asked Jose not to greet him in that manner again. Nevertheless, Jose bowed and promised to respect his wishes. As Daniel had expected, he boarded the bus and found Holly sitting beside him. When all the students were seated, Professor Carter entered, took attendance, and reminded everyone to fasten their seatbelts. At the same time, he secretly observed Daniel with satisfaction. He was pleased that Daniel had chosen the infernal cave. This time, Daniel would not be able to escape his fate. When the students arrived at the location, they were met by 3 people. Leading the group was Carl, a third-year student, a representative of the Shock Fangs, and the current guide for the group. Daniel was surprised to see that they were accompanied by an attack force. After all, this was an elite military unit, whose members possessed sea-level strength. For ordinary students, such a mentor was extremely intimidating. After considering the situation, Daniel realized that they probably intended to kill him, or they had already learned about the Firestone and knew where to find it. Although it was possible that both scenarios were correct simultaneously, upon noticing a hero among the students, the members of the attack force discreetly agreed to initiate their operation. Daniel, however, simply smiled. These people didn't even try to hide their intentions. This family had everything under control. Daniel decided he wouldn't care if his enemies thought he had truly been captured. At that moment, Holly suddenly felt a sinister premonition. Sensing that something bad was happening, she instinctively prepared to draw her sword. She spun sharply toward the main character. The girl couldn't shake the disturbing thought that something terrible had just happened. Holly couldn't understand why the hero suddenly began to exude such a fierce, almost predatory thirst for blood. Meanwhile, the attack team confidently advanced through the dungeon alongside the students, but suddenly Carl stopped moving and explained that further ahead was an unexplored section of the dungeon. The professor admitted that he perfectly understood his students' curiosity, but could only lead them through safe zones. However, upon hearing about the unknown area, the students became even more interested. Carter remarked that it wasn't every day that someone had the opportunity to visit a place like this and asked Carl if they would be allowed to take a look. The commander thought for a moment. After all, his whole group was nearby and could keep an eye on the curious students. However, Holly immediately intervened, reminding them that the students should only be shown safe areas, since this was a training exercise. Her words could completely ruin Carl's plan. Unexpectedly, Daniel himself spoke in favor of the idea. He asked Holly what was wrong with her and suggested that they explore a little further because it would probably be fun. Upon hearing this, Holly indignantly asked if he had gone mad, but Daniel only smiled and observed that sometimes everyone wants to explore a bit of the unknown. Moreover, he reminded them that their mentor and a whole attack team were nearby, so there was nothing to fear. Carl accepted this as the majority opinion and suggested that they move forward. Soon they encountered several goblins, blending into the shadows. Carl silently appeared behind one of them and immediately struck his target. He drove his blade straight into its throat. The second goblin, seeing its companion killed, ran away, but it also could not escape. Carl threw his blade and stopped the fleeing goblin. He then picked up his weapon, carefully wiped off the blood, and calmly asked if they could continue on their way. The students were dissatisfied. It seemed to them that everything had ended too quickly, and they hadn't seen anything truly interesting. Carl simply shrugged and explained that everything in such places was the same, and there was really nothing to see. Suddenly the dungeon shook with a tremor. the ground began to quake, almost knocking everyone over. As the students tried to figure out what had happened, Carl loudly ordered them to run immediately to the portal. He explained that it was not an earthquake but something far more terrifying, a wave. Upon hearing this, the students realized things were taking a dangerous turn and ran for the exit. Jose and Holly left with the others, but the girl soon realized something was wrong and turned around. To her surprise, she saw that Daniel had completely ignored the orders of his mentors and stayed behind. Holly ran toward him asking why he was there but was immediately intercepted by Professor Carter. Carter said sharply that it was far too dangerous to go back. At that moment, Jose ran to the hero and shouted for him to get out immediately, warning that the place was deadly. He almost reached Daniel, who was just a few meters away, but before he could finish speaking, the door suddenly slammed shut in front of Daniel. Jose fell to his knees near the stone slab. He was just one step away from his companion, but it was too late. In desperation, he began pounding his fists on the stone and shouted loudly for his friend, asking if he was alive. Daniel responded that he was fine and told them to stop shouting. Jose agreed and informed the professor that his companion was trapped. Before the mentor could say anything, Carl intervened and suggested that everyone evacuate immediately. Realizing there was nothing else they could do at the moment, Jose agreed to the evacuation. At that moment, Holly broke free from the professor's grasp. She shouted for Daniel to wait where he was and not to even think about leaving. He calmly replied that he understood perfectly and told them to get out quickly. Listening to their footsteps fade, he quietly said that now she could come out. The blue fox emerged from the backpack with a satisfied movement. It had already managed to recharge its energy. Daniel then placed the animal on his shoulder and moved deeper into the cave. After some time, one of the goblins noticed the shadow of a man on the wall. He proposed a plan to his companion. One of them would attack from behind and stun the man, and then they would finish off the prey together. When the man approached, the goblin leapt at him, but the plan failed. The problem was that Daniel had a passive intimidation skill. Because of him, he and Senavika appeared as demons to the monsters. Now the monsters could only tremble in fear. The goblins fled in terror, and Daniel passed by them indifferently. As he advanced through the dungeon, Senavika absorbed low-level dark energy. Thanks to this, she gained the passive skill Evil Energy, and after fulfilling interconnected conditions, she also gained the absorption skill. Additionally, thanks to sea-level energy, the fox learned to absorb dispersed evil power and convert it into high-quality power. However, the hero was far more interested in the SS-level skill, Absorption. He asked the mentor if this was a form of vampiric martial arts. The mentor confirmed there was indeed a resemblance and added that the pet was beginning to resemble its owner. Then smiling, he asked if it was a celestial beast, to which Daniel recalled that it had been his master who had made the choice. While talking with the mentor, he reached the end of the cave, where his objective was located. Daniel then took the firestone. The system immediately asked if he wanted to use it now. Without hesitation, the hero agreed and activated it. Afterward, the mentor noticed that a certain presence could be felt ahead. Daniel replied that nothing could be hidden from him. He then probed the correct spot on the wall and applied the firestone. The system reported that he had discovered a secret location in the infernal cave. As a reward, he received 250,000 martial arts points. Meanwhile, at the entrance of the infernal dungeon, Holly asked Carl why she could not go with them. Carl reminded her that she was the precious heir of the Schock-Fallens family. If anything happened to her suddenly, it could trigger a full-scale clan war. Holly wanted to protest, but the professor ordered her to calm down. Carter added that if the slightest misfortune happened to her, the president would simply kill them. However, Holly was not going to give up so easily. She could not shake the feeling that something was wrong there. Furthermore, it seemed to her that these people did not get along with Daniel. She began to suspect that there was a conspiracy against him. Suddenly, a system notification appeared in front of everyone. To their surprise, the dungeon level changed, and the danger level increased from green to blue. The Rat King became furious because someone had invaded the lair of his leader. Meanwhile, deep within the infernal dungeon, an army of rats began shooting arrows at the hero. However, he remained unmoved. With a wave of his hand, Daniel deflected all the arrows. Suddenly a rat knight appeared nearby, wielding a flaming spear, but before it could continue its attack, Daniel decapitated it in the blink of an eye. Immediately afterward, the system flooded the hero with reports of slain rat warriors, yet the task remained incomplete. Daniel tried to complete it, but it remained unfinished. On the bright side, it seemed that there was no end in sight to the hordes of rats, no matter how many he destroyed. Soon a humanoid rat appeared, slightly larger than the others. Daniel assumed it was the commander. The commander claimed that there was only one man in front of them, and if they attacked him with their full force they could shred him to pieces. The army advanced against the hero, but he easily crushed their ranks one by one. When Daniel approached, the commander realized that things were going badly for him. He ordered his subordinates to kill the man at all costs, but soon it was his turn. The hero appeared instantly beside him, right behind the rat commander. He then kicked off the commander's head, sending it flying. The head only stopped when it was crushed under a massive paw. Daniel then faced an unexpected enemy, a monstrous rat boss. He angrily asked his subordinates if they really meant that their domain had been violated by a single human. Meanwhile, at the dungeon entrance, the students had exited. Carl told his subordinates that he now had legal grounds not to intervene, since the dungeon's level had increased. Apparently this was due to the discovery of the Firestone. This meant they would return later only to retrieve Daniel's body. Meanwhile in the infernal dungeon, the rat boss asked menacingly how a human dared to invade his territory. Daniel clarified to himself that he understood correctly that this particular monster was the master of the infernal dungeon, and if so then the infernal dungeon seemed ridiculously absurd, a huge humanoid body with a rat skull. Upon hearing this, the boss became enraged and shouted that he would rip out the man's tongue and swallow it. Daniel prepared for battle, but suddenly Sanavika appeared in front of him, completely confusing him. The hero tried to stop the animal because it was extremely dangerous. However, the fox pup ran to confront the blow from the infernal axe. Suddenly its eyes began to glow with a bright blue light. The fox pup then used its absorption skill. Daniel was shocked by what he saw. The infernal boss was afraid of the little fox and did not want to die in that way, but Sinavika quickly grabbed it and defeated the monster within seconds. The hero, smiling lightly, admitted to himself that he was prepared for a long fight with the boss, but the small animal resolved everything instantly. Recovering from the shock, Daniel scolded Sinavika for leaping and scaring him so much. He emphasized that one should not act rashly in such dangerous fights without permission. After placing the fox on his shoulder, the hero admitted that he had no idea that Sinavika could use absorption on other monsters. At that exact moment, the system filled him with rewards again, revealing that he had single-handedly defeated a high-level boss. As the hero checked the rewards, the infernal boss's body began to vanish. In its place remained something familiar, the spiritual cultivation technique of the Transcendent Emperor. It was the foundation of the Emperor's spiritual development technique. Its current greatest master was the leader of the Divine Fist family, Emperor Fist, Daniel's father. The word transcendent in the title meant that this technique represented the highest form of spiritual development. However, Daniel did not understand how such a forbidden-level book could have ended up in that cave. When the mentor noticed that Daniel was hiding the book with the techniques, he asked if he wanted to study it immediately. Daniel explained that he was unsure, but probably it belonged to his family who despised him. He did not want to master it, and it would be far more profitable to use the book to blackmail his family. The dungeon had been completely cleared, and the system offered Daniel the opportunity to become its master. The hero decided to transfer control of the dungeon to the power of Sinavika, and with that they completed their work in the dungeon. Then Daniel asked Sinavika to bring the nearby magical stone. The fox pup obediently jumped from his master's shoulder, grabbed the firestone and was about to return to Daniel. However, Sinavika suddenly stopped. Daniel tried to persuade the animal, but it used the absorption technique on the stone. Meanwhile, Carl checked if Daniel had really understood the path correctly. His subordinate confirmed it, noting that the location matched what was marked on the map. This meant that Daniel had indeed claimed the Firestone. However, Carl wondered how this loser had managed to find a way out. At this point, the system reported another change in the dungeon's level. Now, the security level had returned to green. The members of the strike force were perplexed, trying to understand why this had happened. Soon, Daniel himself emerged from the dungeon. At that moment, Carl and the others froze in horror. The hero asked them why they were there and why they had interfered. Carl recalled that Daniel could not have survived without defeating the dungeon boss, which meant he had obtained the Firestone. Daniel wondered what benefit it would bring him if he really had the stone. Carl tried to contain his anger and could not believe that someone like the hero could find such a stone. The operation had been interrupted, and action was required because Martin insisted on delivering the stone. But if Daniel really consumed it, it would take time to digest. And if the stone could not be delivered, they could still use the hero's blood to deliver it to the Emperor Fist. Suddenly the ground shook again, startling the strike force members. As soon as the hero released his energy, the strike team almost fell. Even then, Carl was reluctant to admit that Daniel could become so strong after absorbing the stone. Regardless, he ordered his subordinates to retreat. Suddenly Daniel laughed loudly, confusing the strike team. He then wiped the tears of laughter from his eyes and told himself that they probably thought he had revealed all his power to them. Immediately afterward, the system notified everyone that the owner of the infernal dungeon had closed the exit. Daniel approached them and explained that now they could not leave the dungeon alive. Meanwhile, outside, the students watched the dungeon entrance close. Suddenly, Jose, unable to find space to worry, paced behind Holly, but she quickly told him to stop moving like that because it was annoying. Realizing he had upset her, Jose apologized. Holly continued observing the portal and did not regret anything. Her goal was to assess the hero's abilities. She followed him everywhere, though she could never truly understand his power. Daniel had already defeated the tyrant Chris, the white ice demon, in the competition. Holly concluded that he was carefully hiding his true capabilities. She was certain Daniel would survive, and this only strengthened her conviction. Suddenly, the chains holding the dungeon entrance began to shake. The next moment, they exploded. The students were surprised to see that the entrance had finally opened. Daniel emerged, but Holly was shocked to notice he was bleeding. After taking a few steps, he collapsed, but Holly reached him in time. She picked him up in her arms and asked the hero to look at her and explain what was wrong with him. When the hero lifted his head, Holly was convinced it was truly him, though she remained perplexed about how everything had happened. 3 hours passed and people began to lose patience. The host complained that everything was taking too long and suggested that the reason might be related to the Divine Fist family's strike force. The host added that dungeon vibrations usually did not last more than 15 minutes, although the strike team typically resolved problems faster. Upon hearing this, the operator was surprised and admitted that it was indeed impressive. Suddenly the man noticed something strange. The dungeon gates began to close strangely. The men quickly realized that they were beginning to shut. The story then flashed back a few hours. During the hero's encounter with the strike team, one of the members noticed that Daniel had never been this strong and was about to leave. Before he could finish speaking, his head was immediately separated from his body. Carl, seeing that the fighters were stunned, asked why they were trembling and afraid of some student. He ordered that Daniel be killed immediately, and all the strike force members advanced against him simultaneously. However, Daniel kicked the ground, causing an explosion of energy that struck all the enemies. Seeing this, even Carl began to tremble, for he had never encountered a maniac like Daniel. Earlier, trying to hide the tremor in his voice, he asked if Daniel thought he could escape unpunished. Daniel simply reminded Carl that he was also a member of that family and hinted that perhaps he had forgotten this. Carl was outraged, saying, "How does a man with such tainted blood dare to say such things?" However, before he could add anything, Daniel grabbed his face. He reminded him that without evidence no one could confirm the murder. Under Carl's watchful gaze, Daniel flicked his sleeve and a small dagger flew out. Picking it up, he warned Carl not to hold a grudge, since he was the one who had started it all. After a brief struggle, Daniel easily defeated the members of the strike team, and then sensed someone's presence. Turning around, he saw who was standing behind a rock. A rat peeked awkwardly from behind the stone and asked why Daniel had called it. Daniel explained that there were bodies scattered everywhere and that it was his job to clean up the mess. The rat immediately accepted the order and summoned its relatives to carry out the master's will. It turned out that the rat perfectly understood human speech and was intelligent, making it an ideal candidate for manipulation. Daniel approached the rat, walked up to it, and lightly threatened it with a dagger, declaring that it was now responsible for that area. He then handed it the dagger. The rat asked what it was and why it needed it. Realizing how successful his future plan would be, Daniel could not help but smile. Meanwhile, somewhere in the city, Holly asked what had happened in the dungeon and whether Daniel was okay. Jose also wanted to understand what had happened with his Sebi. Trying to hide the pain, Daniel explained that in the hidden dungeon, his commanders had seen how much pain he endured. The elder, covering himself with a fan, remarked that the hero's performance was so poor that it almost made his eyes ache from embarrassment. Now the protagonist became angry at the rat he had entrusted with the dagger because he had asked it not to hit too hard. The pain caused by the rat's mistake was intense, but thanks to the injury, he managed to dispel some suspicions. Meanwhile, the TV host began broadcasting, announcing that they were in front of the gates of the infernal cave. Suddenly, a tall man appeared on the screen and ordered the reporter to get out of the way. The reporter was surprised, for Leon had suddenly appeared before him. This young man was the successor of the Divine Fist Emperor. Passing among the students, Leon approached the hero, who was somewhat exhausted. He asked him about the current situation. Daniel explained that they had encountered several blue-level bosses, and that after Director Carl returned, he was the only one who survived. Leon wondered if it mattered to the hero that the strike team had been destroyed to save him, but Daniel replied that he did not care whether they believed it or not. Leon was outraged and tried to attack Daniel. However, Jose protected the hero. At that moment, the hero was already preparing for the blow, but nothing happened. Holly immediately drew her sword, and Leon's subordinate grabbed her arm. Holly asked if it was acceptable for members of the 15th Clan Alliance to hit students. Leon was confused about why the girl was defending this kid, but his subordinate explained that there were many eyes nearby. However, Leon ordered him to remain silent, then released Holly's arm and, restraining his anger, looked at the hero. Once everyone calmed down, the subordinate announced that the dungeon would now be under their control. He then asked Carter to inform the president that they would handle it themselves. At that moment, Jose helped Daniel stand and led him to the ambulance. Before reaching the vehicle, Holly turned to Daniel. He asked what she wanted, and Holly recalled the conversation about what had happened in the dungeon. She then asked if it was true. Daniel was surprised by the question and wondered if it would be too rude to answer someone who had almost died. Suddenly, Holly hit the hero and warned that he would regret it if she discovered he had lied. A little later, Hank was sitting at the school. Upon hearing a knock, the president asked the guest to enter. At that moment, Holly entered the office. The president immediately inquired about the hero's well-being. Holly replied that she had been observing him the whole time but could not give a precise answer. Understanding her, Hank noted that Daniel was truly extraordinary, as he could hide his abilities even from Holly. Afterward, Hank mentioned that they had recently received a call from the bank. Daniel had sold them a high-quality magical stone. According to eyewitnesses, Daniel had not left the school for a single moment during that period. Holly confirmed that, as she suspected, the protagonist was hiding his abilities. Now they had to determine how great his abilities were and how he had suddenly gained such enormous power. Holly added that Daniel was hostile toward divine authority, which gave them